Hey, can you see anything on your end? Oh, participants maybe?
Yep, so we have attendees joining now.
Okay. All right, so just for the folks on the meeting, we're going to give it a few more minutes before we start today's presentation. Okay. Well, I think we'll go ahead and kick it off. It's about 11:46, and I know many of you are crunched for time, so we'll try and stick to the schedule. Just in way of introductions, I'm Angela Foose. I'm the Assistant Director here with City of Reno Development Services. Also joining me is Lauren Knox. Lauren, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Lauren Knox. I'm a senior planner here with Development Services as well.
Great. So what we have done is put together a pretty broad presentation to cover some of the updates on our zoning code, because everyone's kind of coming at this from a different perspective. Some of you deal with our zoning code on a more regular basis. Other of you have never opened our zoning code. So this presentation is really geared towards more the general population who maybe aren't familiar with the technicalities of our zoning code. So again, we're trying to keep it pretty broad. We do encourage everyone to go online, read our red line changes, and provide feedback. We have an online mechanism for you to put in comments, or we can set up a separate meeting if you have specific questions as well. So just again, understanding this is a fairly quick presentation, but it's also very high level. And then we do have, it looks like about 6 people in the attendees list. And so if you have questions, go ahead and just raise your hand, virtually raise your hand, and we can work with you to get you into the presentation mode so you can ask those questions. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and kick it off. So the city of Reno adopted a new code back in 2021, and it was a pretty extensive rewrite. We had hired a consultant. We spent a couple years working with that consultant and different stakeholder outreach groups to really clean up the code. And we always knew that there was going to be changes. Anytime you adopt a new major document, you know there's going to be changes. And so initially we thought, oh, we'll just make a list and then come back in about 6 months after adoption, make some of those cleanups. So here we are over 2 years later, and we have a list now of over 400 items that we have found to have errors. And so that list of errors is everything from the basic things, right? We had typos, we had some grammatical errors, but we also had areas where one section of the code conflicted with another section. So we've just been tracking all of those things. It's been about 2 years. And so there's areas that were in our old code that maybe didn't transition to the new code that we've said, oops, we probably should have included that. Those were key things that we just missed inadvertently. We also had a couple things that as administrators or staff trying to interpret the code, when we as staff can't interpret it, we know that we need to go back and take another look and probably rewrite the verbiage so it makes more sense. If staff can't interpret it, there's no way the general public can understand it. So we again, been keeping a list of those things. The other thing that has come out in the last 2 years is we've had some changes at the legislature. They just finished their session this last June. And so there's a couple big things that came out that we are now instructed as local jurisdictions to address. And so we have been incorporating those. The two big ones for this group, one of them is tied to electric fencing. We now have a requirement that as a local jurisdiction, we have to have regulations on electric fencing. And then the other one is tied to Assembly Bill 213, which deals with affordable housing. So they gave us some pretty specific direction on how they want local jurisdictions to help expedite affordable housing projects. So we've included some recommendations as part of that. All right, so those are a big picture, some of the things that we're addressing. Some of the other big topics that we've heard both from our council and from the general community have to do with really bigger policy things. And so those are not what we would consider a code cleanup. So we're addressing those through separate text amendments. The key ones that we're working on right now is a new sign ordinance. So we've hired a consultant to help us rewrite the sign ordinance. We'll do separate stakeholder outreach meetings for that. So we're not addressing that with the code cleanup. Same with our telecommunications. Probably something you don't think about much is where do we allow cell towers? But that's something from a administrative perspective. Our code is very outdated and doesn't meet a lot of the new federal regulations. So we've hired a consultant to help us rewrite a new telecommunications ordinance. Another big one that our council has been pushing for is an ordinance on accessory dwelling units. We will deal with that separately, not part of the code cleanup. And then also similar to that topic is short-term rentals. These are like ADUs and VRBOs. The city of Reno does not currently regulate short-term rentals. And so we've been asked to put together an ordinance. So that will be done separate. And we'll go again through a separate stakeholder outreach process. All right, so just process and timeline. So we have been, again, collecting information from our staff and from the outside world of some of the challenges, these code cleanups. So we had over 400 items. So we've spent the last summer really updating our zoning code with that red line document. And then we held about 3 months worth of meetings with our technical advisory committee. And this is the folks that actually use the zoning code. And we kind of gave ourselves a threshold. If you open the zoning code more than 5 times a week, we would consider you someone that would make sense to sit on our technical advisory committee. So that's architects, landscape architects, planners, engineers, city staff, really, again, folks that are more the technical experts that use the zoning code on a weekly basis. So we held 3 months worth of meetings with them, getting their feedback, going through all the red lines. And so we've included some of the edits as part of what you guys are looking at now. So now we're looking at a couple of weeks where we're reaching out to the stakeholders. We have a list of, gosh, I think 650 people that have shown interest. These are folks that just community, advocates. These are people that sit on our NABs, our neighborhood advisory boards, people that sit on other committees here at the city of Reno. And so we've set up about 6 different meetings in morning, lunchtime, at night, virtual, in person, trying to give the most option of just people's schedules. So we are in that process now where we're doing a stakeholder engagement, reaching out and having you guys take a look. And then next steps is we will be holding workshops with our planning commission. Those will all be public meetings. And so they'll be on the agendas, our planning commission agendas. So anyone from the public that's interested can come and participate in those meetings. Once we get through the planning commission review and approval, we will then take their recommendation to city council, and we'll be holding more meetings with city council in that public setting at those public meetings and getting their input and buy-in. And hopefully ultimate adoption winter of 2024, which is actually just around the corner. All right, so again, high level, let's go through some of the big changes that we're going to break it down by category. The first one is changes we've made to the landscape section. So we had quite a bit of discussion with some of the local landscape architects, and we asked them, you know, what's working, what's not? Does our code make sense? The way that we regulate landscaping is generally you take whatever your zoning is. Let's say you're in a multifamily zoning district. So you go to a table and it says, here's how many what percentage of your site needs to have landscaping. So that's kind of step one. And then beyond that, it says, well, how many parking spaces do you have? That equates to a certain number of trees that you have to have. A step beyond that is you calculate all the trees that are required, and then you have to have a certain number of shrubs. And so all of that has pretty much stayed the same. And talking to the landscape architect community, that still makes sense to them. One thing that we did incorporate, though, is how we calculate tree caliper. You know, for years, we have calculated the size of the tree by the trunk size. So now we're looking at just some new language that we've heard is more kind of best practices, and it's based on breast height. And so it's just a different way of measurement. But again, it's something that seems to be more aligned with kind of best practices for what landscape architects use to calculate trees. So again, that's something, not a major change, but just something that from an enforcement perspective that seems to be better aligned with how others are calculating trees. We do have some language in our code that if you have an existing site, such as like a shopping center, and you have a new use coming in, maybe that shopping center was built 20 years ago. And so, you know, it's definitely doesn't meet today's landscape standards. We have some language in the code that's kind of confusing of like how much of your site then has to meet today's landscape standards. If it's the same use, but maybe instead of a shopping center that had a Trader Joe's, now you have a shopping center that has an In-N-Out burger and a new commercial use. And so we've clarified the code to say that when you're expanding one of these existing uses, we're not going to make you bring the entire site into today's standards. That seems to kind of dissuade developers from being able to actually make any development happen in these existing shopping centers. So we've said that we will make it more of a proportional change. With some of the key things that we want to see is landscaping on the perimeter of your parking lot. So rather than having to take out a bunch of parking spaces because now you have to put in trees, again, we're trying to make it more advantageous to be able to say, let's rehab those old shopping centers, but not make it so cost prohibitive that you can't make it happen because you have to tear out the entire parking lot and redesign everything to add new trees and new shrubs. So trying to find more of that middle ground to rehab these existing parking lots or shopping centers to meet our landscape code. Another big change that we made has to do with screening. We have a lot of existing regulations on screening between different zoning districts. So we've updated that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But within that, we also took a hard look of how we do screening. You can screen with fencing, you can screen with trees. And so we took a harder look to say, are we providing enough screening standards, and should we be requiring more trees when we're doing screening? So we actually put in stricter requirements to add more landscaping for some of those screening requirements. We have a lot of areas where you can't meet, let's say, your landscape code or the requirements of the landscaping. You have a new development coming in, maybe it's a small infill site. And it doesn't maybe make sense to put in all the trees and the landscaping. Maybe you want to do something better. So we do have an administrative process that you would have to go through in order to get that approved. So this would, again, allow more flexibility, but you still have to go through a process where we notify the public. The neighbors would get a notice and be able to go in and make some comments of their own. And the developer would have to show how whatever they're proposing related to landscaping is better than or equal to what the code requires. One of the other challenges we have in our current code is related to parkway strips. So we do have requirements of how many trees and the spacing of the trees on parkway strips, right? That's basically that area between the street and the sidewalk. And what we found is our regulations are a little too restrictive in that it doesn't really take into account, let's say you have a driveway and we're requiring that you put in a tree right next to the driveway. Well, that becomes an issue when you're trying to get a car safely in and out. We don't really have any flexibility to say, oh, well, you should have those trees, but maybe move them back. So we've provided some flexibility from the administrator level where, yep, we can still look at specific to parkway standards. We want to make sure that we're protecting the vehicles and the people walking on sidewalks and not putting trees in places just because our code says you have to, making it make more sense with whatever your site looks like. So updated that in the code. And then we had some duplicative requirements, and some of them conflicted. We had screening requirements that talked about landscaping, and then we had separate landscape requirements, and so they really conflicted. So we cleaned that up and tried to have one set of standards, so you're not looking through a code saying, gosh, what's the rules? I feel like there's too many of them and they conflict with each other. All right, so screening, Lauren's going to talk about some of the changes we've made to screening between uses.
Sure. So Angela really touched on some of these pieces already, but generally with screening, we used to have a screening table, or in the current version of the code, we had a screening table where it looks at screening between different zoning districts. That could cause some issues in terms of some of those zoning districts. For example, the mixed use districts allow for both commercial and residential type uses. So there wasn't always adequate screening between those specific uses. So we took that table and amended it to actually describe screening between uses versus those zoning districts. This is really intended to protect a lot of those residential uses a little bit better, as I discussed, kind of in those mixed use areas particularly. We clarified the different types of screening. Again, there's the three versions: solid, semi-opaque, and wall. One thing that we did hear from our technical advisory committee is that what we have in the current version of code is trees have to be included every 30 feet. We were told that those could actually, we could add a little bit more trees in there without impacting kind of the spacing needed for trees. So we bumped that up to one tree every 20 feet for screening, and also described the number of shrubs that would be needed, just to add that clarity piece. Another thing that we did with screening, we actually went through every single additional use that we have, additional use standard in our current code, and looked at each of those uses to say, do we need to include screening for each of these uses? And where that really came out was a lot of the industrial type uses, and ensuring that we're talking about adequate screening within those uses specifically as well. I think that pretty much covers what we did for screening.
Great. All right, fencing. So over the years, we have modified our fencing standards kind of based on, oh, we found this one unique situation, so our entire code needs to be updated. But over the years, it's gotten to the point where it doesn't even make sense anymore. And so our general fencing standards you think of as, single family homes, you have a 6-foot fence, great, what's the big deal? Where we run into a lot of conflicts is some of these commercial developments and industrial developments. How tall can the fencing be? We do allow fences to be taller in those industrial areas where you're screening things like outdoor storage. And so again, our current code just really didn't make sense and conflicted with each other. So we tried to just make it more simplified, but still have those same protections in place. Allow taller fencing when you have these outdoor storage areas, and we just want to protect, the cars driving by or the businesses next door, so that you don't have to stare at this outdoor storage all day. One of the other big areas that we took out of our code that we did not put in our new code is this idea of a vision triangle. We used to have an image in our zoning code that showed what a vision triangle is. For the most part, our engineers and planners, they know what that means, but an average citizen who is going to put in a fence, and maybe they're on a corner lot, they'd open the zoning code and it would say, must adhere to the vision triangle. And if you don't know what that is, it makes it really complicated to figure out how tall your fencing can be if you're on a corner. So what we're proposing is really just to clarify what that vision triangle is. And again, more for the average citizen who's trying to understand it. Again, if you have a complicated case where you're a commercial development, you have big trucks coming in and out, our engineers, they refer to AASHTO, which is a separate set of standards. So we look at all those regulations, but we try to just kind of simplify it for the average citizen who wants to put a fence in their front yard or their side yard. And then the other kind of really big change was related to that electric fencing standard, again, that came out of this last legislative session. City of Reno has to include standards for electric fences. And so we basically copied and pasted those standards that were approved by the legislature and put them into our zoning code. And kind of what that means is, yes, you can now have electric fencing. It's the type of fencing you would typically see if you're an auto repair shop, where maybe you have cars being stored on your site at night and you want to have fencing to protect those cars. So we've had a handful of these electric fences come in, and without a set of standards, it made it tough for us to regulate. But essentially, we're still making sure that, when you walk by, there's a big sign on the fence that says, warning, electric fence, don't touch. And that electric fence is within, I think it's 5 feet or 8 feet of that outside fence. So no, if you're an average person walking by, you're not going to get shocked. But if you are jumping that fence, trying to do something you're not supposed to be, there's another fence on the inside, but you will get shocked. So a big change in terms of us, because now we regulate that. But again, understand that's something that got passed down by the legislature. Okay. Parking. So we didn't make a whole lot of substantive changes to the parking. When we did our code cleanup 2 years ago, as part of that, we did make some pretty big changes in terms of our parking requirements. So we had a couple uses, just business type uses that we did not have parking requirements. So we added those, just adding, again, more clarification. And then we realized that our requirements for handicap parking or ADA parking is different than what the building code requires. So we had 2 sets of standards. We have 2 sets of documents, our uniform building code that we're required to adhere to. And then we had a zoning code, parking requirements. And so those 2 conflicted. So we said, whoa, let's just go with what the uniform building code is. That's a set of national standards specific to handicap or ADA parking. So we made that consistent with the building code. And then in our current code, we actually penalize you if you want to put in more parking than code requires. So we have a window of about 10%. Let's say you're putting in a use, maybe you're doing a call center where you know that you're going to need more parking because you have a lot of employees that come for that use. But our zoning code only says you can have 20 parking spaces. And if you know you need more, then obviously you're going to want to put in more. And so we were penalizing those users and making them put in additional landscaping. So we've taken that out. Parking is one of those tough things where on one hand, you want to reduce parking and encourage more people to walk. But on the other hand, you need to have some minimum standards that at least gives us a general number that everyone's meeting. So we want to stop penalizing people that know they need more parking. If they need more and they want to put in more, that's fine. They still have to put in landscaping based on the number of parking spaces. So the number of trees and shrubs will go up the more parking they put in. But again, we will let the market kind of dictate. We have a minimum standard. If you want to do more, then you're welcome to. We also found that on our old code, we had requirements for what type of construction material you had to have in your parking lot. And we inadvertently left that out of the new code. So we just copied and pasted those requirements and put them back in the code. Where we see this a lot is some people don't want to have to pave their parking lot. And so we said, whoa, you absolutely have to pave your parking lot. We don't want to see cars with oil and gas leaking into our soil and then getting into our water system. That's why we have these requirements. So somehow we just missed that and accidentally took that out. So we put it back in. The other really big one I would say related to our parking is drive-throughs. We have some requirements for what we call queuing or stacking. That's how many cars you have to provide enough space for at drive-throughs like Starbucks or McDonald's. And for the most part, our standard works. I will say we've had some big drive-through users come in, especially kind of post-COVID. That's the In-N-Out Burger and the Dutch Brothers. And so when you have these users that definitely have more than 7 cars backed up at one time, it becomes a major conflict. So we added some language into our code that when you come in for your building permit or your entitlement, we as staff have the right to ask for a queuing study. so that you can tell us what, generally speaking, you think your demand is going to be. And, you know, the big users, Dutch Brothers is probably the best example. There's Dutch Brothers across the nation. So they know that they need more queuing space. So we're asking them to provide us a study, make sure staff agrees with it, and then they would have to meet that study, the standard in that study, rather than just our zoning code study. So hopefully this is something that will help some of these drive-throughs that we have challenges with. And lighting. Lauren, did you want to take that one?
Sure. All right, so the big pieces with lighting, we amended the requirements for when exterior lighting, the exterior lighting article needs to be followed. Previously, it was required for any proposed addition or renovation that was more than 500 square feet. That was kind of the trigger before. Now we've changed that to be when new exterior lighting is installed or modified. So we wanted to clarify when that would fit in terms of condensed standards for freestanding or wall-mounted lighting. So our standards for this particular section actually started out with prohibited lighting first, and it had this big long list of all the things you can't do, and that didn't really match up with kind of what the rest of the development code, how it's laid out. So we tried to clarify, okay, what is permitted, doing the same form that we do for all of the rest of the development code. So some of the key pieces in there, we do have a requirement now for lighting fixtures within 100 feet of residentially zoned property, can't exceed 18 feet in height. So again, trying to protect those residential uses there. We also, in the current code, we regulate 3 different things. We regulate kelvins, we regulate foot candles, and lumens. We are finding issues with those regulations because we weren't always able to enforce those. We didn't have the right and proper equipment to monitor lumens. And it wasn't a typical thing you see in any other development codes in terms of regulating all 3 of those forms of lighting. So we tried to clean that up a bit too, to something that was more standard with other development codes, as well as items that we can actually be able to enforce. So we now are looking at foot candles and kelvins. And then I think that actually covers most of the big items for lighting.
Great. All right, the next one is sustainability. So we currently have quite a few, I would say, kind of little hidden Easter eggs in our zoning code that address some sustainability standards, but we're always looking for ways we can do this better. Some of the obvious ones that people ask is, why don't we have an EV charging stall requirement? Our zoning code currently does not require EV charging parking spaces or really even mention EV charging stalls at all. The building code gets updated every couple of years. And this is, again, our uniform building code. It is going through an update process now, and they are going to be adding requirements for EV charging stations. So we're holding out to make sure we don't put something in code that conflicts with the uniform building code. So once that's adopted, then that will be easy to reference. Development will have to put in EV charging stations based on whatever the building code requires. So we're keeping that separate. Some of the things that we are proposing, though, with this code update, tied to tree protection standards. This is something there's been a lot of discussion about in the past when we were looking at a tree ordinance. And so we tried to take some of the elements that were agreed upon, again, in previous meetings and whatnot with the Urban Forestry Commission and staff, to put in some more safeguards for protecting those existing trees. And so, again, not a huge undertaking, but something that is the more we can do to make the community more sustainable and address some of those urban heat island issues by keeping trees, I think the better off we're all going to be. Another one, and this is a simple one, but it has to do with our air quality, is requirements when you have sites that are tracking dust and dirt onto the streets. We call it just kind of tracking out. And so we put in some regulations that better regulate that you can't have tracking out of the dirt and dust on development sites. And then we had a handful of just different zoning districts that had no landscape requirements. Again, that was more of an inadvertent oops. So it's a funny story. If you are near the airport, we have a zoning district that's near the airport, mixed use airport. There's no landscape requirements, which again, inadvertent oops. Of course, we want to see landscaping. So we've added, I think there was 3 different zoning districts that we did not require landscaping. So we've put in have turf or grass. And so you have spray irrigation, and it's always windy in Reno. And so you'd see this spray irrigation, not only spraying on the turf or the grass, but also spraying into our streets. And so that does a lot of damage to the streets itself. So we've added a new requirement that we don't want to see that spray irrigation within 18 inches of the street. And this is something we worked with Tumwa to see if this is something they were on board with. We worked with our public works staff to say, does this make the most sense? Again, not a huge deal from the development side of things, but something the more we can do to protect those streets so we don't have to pay more to maintain them more often, the better off we are and the more sustainable we are as a community. And then again, addressing how many trees are required depending on what your use is. When we looked at our screening standards, screening between different types of uses, we increased the number of trees that you have to have when you're screening between uses. So adding more trees as a requirement, keeping in mind too that if you put in too many trees, they're too close together and then they can't grow. So we worked with the landscape architecture to community to come up with what makes sense. Again, in providing more trees, but not requiring them so many that we're throwing too many into an area that they won't grow. All right, historic preservation. So we have a whole chapter on historic preservation, and most of this is regulated through our Historic Resource Commission. And we just found some cleanup items that maybe, so when we, for instance, when we do noticing, if you have a historic resource, something on the city registry, you would have to bring it in, you're making changes to it, you bring it in, it goes to the Historic Resource Commission for them to vote on. And we had kind of conflicting regulations for how we do public notice for any other project versus a historic resource project. So we cleaned that up and said, let's just make sure we're notifying neighbors in the same manner. Other big things, again, we had other inconsistencies, which is process, so we cleaned those up. And then we ran into some issues with our current zoning code that says, if you're on the historic registry and you're making changes, first talk to staff. And they will then determine if you are exempt from going back to the Historic Resource Commission, or if you should have to go back, depending on what those changes are. We decided, that's probably something we don't want staff to have to make the decision on. It should be the historic resource or the experts that make that decision. For instance, if you're on the registry and you want to make changes to your landscaping, we may think as staff like, oh, well, that doesn't impact the historic nature of this building, when in fact, maybe one of the reasons that building was on the registry was for the landscaping itself. So we're taking staff out of that process and putting the experts, the historic resource commissioners, in the lead to say whether or not it triggers any kind of review by the Historic Resource Commission. And then we did take this to the Historic Resource Commission, got their input, went back a second time, made sure they were comfortable. So the changes that were made are not substantial, but enough that it cleans up, clarifies, and the Historic Resource Commissioners were on board and supported those changes. Next topic is related to affordable housing. So I will add that just yesterday, we held a housing workshop with our city council, and we talked about some of the changes that we're proposing in the code cleanup. And they gave us direction that they wanted us to take these changes out of this process and do a completely separate text amendment tied just to housing. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this because it's not going to be part of the code cleanup. We're going to take these things out and do a separate process to make sure our council and the community feels that we're doing enough to address housing. So know that that discussion will be coming at a future time. Same with incentives for infill. It's a separate discussion. We're going to pull these out of the code cleanup and have just a broader discussion with a specific topic of housing. And so we'll be dealing with that at a future time. All right, protection in neighborhoods. This is one thing that, old code to new code, we ran into some conflicts. We currently have some regulations about if you have a single family neighborhood and you're putting in maybe a 2-story apartment complex or a 3-story apartment complex, how those two interact together. At the end of the day, we're trying to protect the characters of those existing neighborhoods while encouraging new development and infill. So some of the requirements that we have are maybe a new building coming in has to have a wider setback than they normally would because they're taller. We also have what we call step backs, meaning maybe not your first story, but on your second story, we want the second story to be stepped back in a certain distance. Our challenge is it's really confusing, the standards and code. We as staff have differing opinions on how to interpret it. So there's no way that the development community even understands what they are if we can't understand what they are. So we're taking a harder look at those and saying, I don't know that we're really addressing this correctly. Some of the things that we, again, are kind of looking for input from the stakeholder group is, does it make sense for let's take one example. Let's say you have a 3-story apartment complex that's coming in next to a 2-story house. On one hand, we're saying, because you're 3 stories coming in next to a 2-story house, we want to have wider kind of protection or buffers between the 2 uses. You know, your zoning may allow you to be 5 feet from the property line with that 3-story apartment complex. And is that enough? So we're looking at putting in maybe more of some options to say, move the building back. So it's not 5 feet from the property line. That new building would have to be moved back further. Or maybe we add more step back requirements and we identify specifically what that step back is required to be. Should it be 2 feet? Should it be 5 feet? You know, just again, we're trying to protect those neighborhoods while definitely encouraging infill. We also added some language that whatever the code says, if you want to do something different, we put in a process where you could go through a public process to say, here's what I'm proposing that's different than what the code requires. Maybe it's a unique situation where you want to put in some of those kind of coniferous trees, so it's more of more like a wedge or a wall of trees where they're all close together, and you know, 365 days a year, it still provides that buffer rather than just some trees where you have leaves half the year and not the other half the year. So we did provide some flexibility where the developer can propose something and show that they're still meeting the intent and doing hopefully something to help buffer and protect that existing neighborhood, but they would have to go through that public process to get that approved. Another big thing that we addressed, just looking at our different uses and our different use standards, specifically things like big industrial buildings where you have loading docks. We wanted to make sure that we're protecting residents that are next door to those loading docks. And so we have regulations to say, if you have these dock doors and these loading docks, focus them more on facing the street or anything other than residential so that you're protecting those homes. Other things like car washes, you know, we tend to see a lot of car washes in more of a neighborhood setting. And so sometimes they're great and they don't cause any problems. Other times they're 24 hours a day and they're loud and they're noisy for those neighbors. So we put in some specific standards for those types of uses. And then we do have requirements already for what we call residential adjacency. And that is basically if you have a non-residential use and you're next door or within a certain distance of residentially zoned property, we have additional standards. And so we kind of had some conflicts in our code of what's considered a distance from residential adjacency. Some sections of our code said if you're 150 feet, then you trigger these standards. Other sections of our code said it's 300 feet. So we kind of went with the broader one and we said if you are within 300 feet of a residential zoning, then you have to meet these additional standards. So just providing a little bit more protection for those residents that have new development moving in and causing some conflicts. And then again, just on compatibility, you know, we want to make sure that we create these walkable neighborhoods where we have a mix of uses, but again, protecting those existing residents to make sure that things like noise, lighting, especially these 24-hour operations where maybe you have vehicles that drive around a building, making sure that they're not conflicting with those existing residents. So we tried to add in some additional standards to address those types of issues. All right, and similar to that is our industrial development. Currently, we have some areas of town, just based on your zoning, where if you have an industrial development that wants to do 24 hours a day, there's no public hearing process. And so we said, yeah, we're getting a lot of pushback on that. You know, anything that's a 24-hour use next to residential or close to residential probably should have a broader kind of input process. And so we've changed the rules to say, if you are an industrial use, you do require a conditional use permit, which is a planning commission approval. So that goes to the NABs, goes to the planning commission. We send out public notices. so that the neighbors can come and kind of express anything that they're concerned about. The biggest things we see with industrial development is lighting. And so as Lauren talked about with our lighting standards, we now have requirements where we've lowered the height requirement for lights. A lot of these big industrial developers want to do, really tall lights and light up the whole parking lot, which is lit up 24 hours a day. So we said, if you're next to industrial, we need those lights to be lowered. They all still have to adhere to the dark skies, which means they have to be shielded and pointed downward to help protect those neighbors. But we've added some kind of additional assurances that the lights won't be as tall as they want to be. We've limited those lights, whether they're on a wall or in a parking lot, to 18 feet in height. You can always do lower, but you can't do taller. Other than that, the dock doors, which we kind of talked about before, we've required some additional screening requirements if you have dock doors. And then again, we want to see those dock doors not facing residential, facing some of the other types of uses, whether it's commercial, industrial, or the roads itself, but ultimately protecting those residents that live next door. So next steps. Again, this was a very high level of the zoning code. We definitely encourage folks that are interested in more of the technical piece to take a look at the document that we've posted on our website and provide those comments. So we have a link where you can provide your comments. Is this enough? Should we be doing more? Have we missed some things? We're definitely encouraging the community to give us their feedback and let us know if we've missed the mark on anything, or if we need to be doing more. Keep in mind too, we're trying to keep this limited to what we call a code cleanup. Anything that's a big policy shift or a change, we'd have to get council to initiate some of those changes. So this is kind of limited to just the challenges we've had with our current code. Next steps then, we'll be doing more of these stakeholder meetings. And then before this goes anywhere, before it goes to council for approval, we'll also be doing workshops with our planning commission, getting their input. Ultimately, they provide a recommendation to council. And so then we'll be going to council in early 2024 to go through, again, more feedback and getting their buy-in before they officially approve it. So all super exciting stuff. If you have not seen our website yet, it's a separate zoning code update website where you can get information on this presentation. It's posted on there. You can download the document, and our zoning code is big. It's, I think, over 700 pages. And so there's a lot to go through. But again, if you have the time and are interested or want to forward this to any of your friends or neighbors or coworkers, please do let them know that we are definitely, keeping this open. It's another 6-month process before anything's officially adopted. So just because we put it in there as recommendations does not mean that that's what the planning commission or city council will agree to. This is just kind of where we're at in the process now. I'm looking for your feedback. So any questions from the group? Again, kind of wave your virtual hand and we'll give you access to the mic. Mike. Okay, Lauren will move you over.
Yep, Mike, you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, very good. Within the at least the red line version that's being reviewed right now, there were also some sort of minor revisions to the zoning districts themselves in regards to number of stories allowed within the existing districts.
Yes.
Is that something that's moving forward or is considered too radical for the council?
No, and so just for the group's kind of background, so within the zoning code, we list every single zoning district. And I think we have, I don't know, maybe 20 different zoning districts. Within each of those districts, we have building setbacks, building height requirements, all of those individual standards. So our current code regulates the number of stories you can have in those zoning districts, but also regulates building height. So what we have found is that some of our zoning codes or districts are allowed to do weird things, like you're capped out at 2.5 stories. It's difficult to actually interpret what is a half story or why did we even limit something to 2.5 stories? Doesn't really make sense. So we said, let's keep the building height and then you still have to meet that. But however many stories you can fit within that is what we're referencing. So we're deleting any reference to a maximum number of building stories, but keeping the maximum building height.
Another small change that was in there is in reference to parking standards in level 1 parking districts, which is basically Midtown commercial, within, I think it's a quarter mile of South Virginia Street, where the
Okay.
standard was being reduced from 0.6 spaces per unit to 0.5. Is that something that is still proposed to move through?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think specifically what that one is. Lauren, is that one ringing a bell?
Not ringing a bell. I can pull up the code, red line.
Yep. Let's do that while we're kind of going through the other changes. We'll get back to that comment.
Okay.
Any other comments, Mike?
And I guess based on the sort of embarrassing workshop response from council yesterday, are there other things that you're seeing that weren't specifically addressed in this meeting based on density and housing that would also be coming out of the red line edition that we are currently reviewing?
So just for reference from yesterday, again, we held a housing workshop with council. We had a guest speaker, Shane Phillips, who has written a book on what's called the affordable city, coming up with ideas of what communities can do to make housing more of a priority. Again, it's the entire nation is in a housing crisis. Are there things we could be doing to bring housing to market faster or less expensive or provide more options? So Shane provided a number of examples of things that Reno could be doing, whether it's changing some of our zoning districts to allow for more density, or taking away parking requirements altogether and saying, kind of let the market dictate what parking should be. So he proposed a number of changes. And again, nothing that anyone has to do today, but things that we could do if we wanted to have more housing opportunities. We also talked with the council about some of the things that we were proposing with the code cleanup. And at the end of the day, they said, let's have a separate discussion on all things related to housing. So we'll have to go back to council probably in the next month or two and ask them for a little bit more direction on what other things they would like us to move forward with related to housing. So anything in the current draft that deals with a density bonus or incentives for affordable housing, we're going to take out and have a separate text amendment on that topic.
Thank you for humoring me.
Mike, back to your parking question. Do you happen to have which page or which section number you're referencing? I'm trying to find the discussion about level 1 parking, the concern or the issue that you brought up.
Let me see if I can get to it real quickly here.
All right, while we're waiting, Mike, Art, did you want to ask some questions?
Art, you should be able to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, I should know better. I said, let me repeat. I've not been able to attend any of the in-person workshops or meetings. What kind of attendance have you had for the few that you've had so far?
I would say very low. We have 6 people today in attendance. We've had three in-person meetings. One was at City Hall, one was at O'Brien Middle School in North Valleys, and one was at the McKinley Art Center. And they've been very, very small attendance at all 3 of them.
Yeah, I suspected that. That's too bad. I'm really glad to see the staff in the city going after best practices around the country. It's really the right way to do it. About where you had inconsistencies within the code, I presume that when you had an inconsistency, I presume you went to the master plan to see, what policies within the master plan are those that really should be involved, because NRS requires consistency between the master plan and the local ordinances. Is that something that you did? Just to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to clarify, some of our inconsistencies really they were standards that conflicted with each other. So for example, maybe our landscape code section said you had to have your trees spaced every 30 feet. And then our screening section of code said your trees have to be spaced every 20 feet. So again, which standard takes precedence? So we tried to clean some of those inconsistencies up.
Okay, I was just curious because there's I was very pleased when the city went through its master plan update. I followed that. I've written those myself, and I think the city did a very good job back in
Good.
the day. I think it was 4,000 people that participated. There's some good policies in there
Mhm.
that
And
really have to
100%.
be are required to be followed within these ordinances. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Great. All right, and then Mike, were you able to find your
Yeah, I
level
tried to
one
do
version?
chat, that didn't work. Hey, Lauren, I have it at 1804, 705, A.1, point B, pardon me, point 2. Where before it was 60% of the zone 1 parking. So a unit would be 6/10 of a space, and now it is a 60% reduction, which would be to 0.4 space. Just want to make sure that's still standing.
Yeah, so actually, Mike, I found that same issue. I went through a whole review of the whole code, and I saw that as well. And I kind of looked at them like, I'm not sure if that's what we truly meant. So it's actually on our list internally to discuss. If we were trying to clarify that the 60% would be a reduction, or if we were trying to say it's a 60% reduction, because like you said, those are two different things. So definitely hear your comment. I think Angela, it's on our list to discuss kind of what that was meant to do.
So still in process.
Yeah.
Okay. It's probably not really a huge deal because anyone building down there is going to be providing pretty much one-to-one. At least my sort of client base would, but
Mhm.
especially if we're, as I've said, all development solves for parking. So we kind of really know what that standard, we need to know what that standard is.
Yeah. Okay. All right, any other questions from our participants?
I believe Art raised his hand again.
I
Oh,
did.
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I forgot a question. What was the reason to change the designation of the mixed use downtown districts to whatever it's called? It's something corridor.
Urban corridor. So
Urban corridor.
this was again more of a conflict of what? We have probably 4 or 5 different zoning districts that are called mixed use. We've got mixed use urban, mixed use suburban, mixed use downtown. And so that's a zoning designation. The higher level those, we were calling all those mixed use districts, but lumped in with that was things like general commercial zoning, neighborhood commercial zoning, professional office zoning. So from a user perspective, there was a lot of confusion of, wait, if it's mixed use zoning, is that a mixed use district? Or if it's everything lumped into that broader category, is it a mixed use district? So it was more of just nobody could figure out what we meant by a mixed use district when we also have mixed use zoning districts. So we tried to just say, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about more urban designations. And so we just cleaned up everything that was within those, kind of lumped into those zoning districts of all the mixed use zoning districts, plus general commercial and neighborhood commercial and professional office. We were calling those more urban areas.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right. It makes more sense this way than
Yeah.
the way it was
And again,
before.
it really has no substantive changes to the code. We're not changing any zoning districts, but higher level, what are we calling those areas? They're really just more urban areas rather than mixed use areas.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So again, if there's questions or thoughts that come up later, you can feel free to reach out to myself or Lauren or Grace. Her email is on our website, or just provide some comments in that public comment tab on the website. And that way we can better track good things, bad things, questions that we can help address as we work through the next 6 months. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you for joining.
Thanks, everyone.